So we have Kat, who works for the MRC, is that right?
For the MRC Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine.
There you go. And then we have Frank Norman, who works for the Crick Institute, and I must give a big thanks to Frank for helping with today's venue as well. And then we have David Colquhoun, Colquhoun, is that pronounced? Colquhoun, who is a retired researcher from UCL. Is that right?
Well, officially retired, yes. Still writing papers.
And a big fan of SpotOn as well, may I add. And then we finally have Elodie, who works for Pint of Science France, but is also an ex-researcher from Imperial College London. Sorry, what did I say?
UCL.
Oh, UCL, sorry, of course, UCL. Knew this. So I'm going to now hand over to Kat, who's going to be moderating today's session, but please do feel free to chip in where you feel. Again, this is an unconference session, so it's really to be driven by the community and by today's group. So, Kat, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, so as Laura said, none of us thought they were going to be here talking about communities today, and I've never chaired a session before, so be kind to us, is all I can say. So when Laura put a tweet out asking, well, what do we think that we hadn't talked about today yet, immediately came to my mind to talk about community. The reason for that is because I've been thinking a little bit about what is the thread that links all the jobs I've done so far. And digital communications is one of them, but ultimately it all comes down to community. So what I thought we could do, since, what we mean by community and so on, we haven't really coordinated our efforts. So what we thought we could do is, I'll speak for a few minutes about why I'm interested in it and what do I mean by it, and then maybe we'll go around. And then, if you have any questions, I have sort of, a page of things I just jotted down in a half an hour ago. So hopefully, we can all join together and discuss what we mean by communities. Are they important? Are there too many communities? How do we foster a community? Can we make it from scratch? And so on and so forth. So just to explain who I am. So I am the Public Engagement and Communications Officer at the MRC at Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine at the University of Oxford. But before that, I did a DPhil at Oxford, and then I worked for 3 years for The Node, which is a online community website for developmental biologists, where I was a community manager, so you can see the link here. And then I worked for one of the colleges at the University of Oxford for a year, and then moved to the job where I'm now. And the reason why I thought community was interesting is because one thing I've noticed in all these different jobs is that whatever it is that you're trying to do in terms of communication, or in reality in terms of anything, it really matters whether people think they feel part of something, whether they feel like they're kind of all in it together, because that's the only reason why anyone does anything, why we put our effort, often our extra time, to do something. And in fact, the more I think about communities, the more I think, well, actually the very first community I've belonged to, I think, was the lab. Right? At least in my lab, it was very much, it felt like a community. And there was things that we did that fostered that sense of community, which went from, our annual lab retreats to we made cakes for each other for our birthdays. So I guess the questions I'm interested in are really, the reason why I wanted to have this session is because I wanted to know what people think about this is, what are the communities that we belong to? What makes you feel like you're part of a community? How do we encourage that? What are we willing to do if we're part of that community? And so on and so forth.
Hi, so I'm librarian here at the Crick. Interesting, you talked about communities at a small level on the lab. So here, Laura suggested I talk about the whole community of the Crick and how that came about. The Crick was formed from 2 different institutes, and those were on 3 different sites. And there was also the Crick project office, kind of the head office staff, which was on a 4th site. So we had really 4 different communities came together to make the Crick. And they are separated in many ways, head office versus the rest of the world, the 2 different institutes. And the 2 institutes, they were very similar to each other, 2 laboratory-based biomedical research institutes. But as we got closer and closer together, we realized how different they were. They do it that way, we do it this way. So that was an interesting process of realizing that the difference. There's a very long period leading up to our merger to make the Crick. So there's lots of communications, giving messages out, but that wasn't enough. There was a lot of suspicion and distrust between the different communities, and especially the head office. Or was this being recorded? I forgot. So the most successful early methods, I think, were identifying different strata of all of the communities. So, for instance, the group leaders across all the sites would meet together. The postdocs across all the sites, they had a couple of conferences for postdocs, and similarly for the PhD students. And eventually they formed a common PhD program, so that there were 100 cohort of 100 PhD students starting all together. We had more and more communications as we actually came together officially. In April 2015, we became one institute, although still on 4 different sites. Communications increased, and at least there was a common infrastructure then. We were all employed by the same organisation. And obviously the senior people and some others came together a great deal planning the new building, and then huge amounts of work from lots of staff on the migration. So again, that brought people together. But really, I think the biggest thing that's contributed to the Crick feeling as one institute is coming into this single new building and all the staff being together, having the proximity and the big lift from being in this building. I think people felt proud of it. The restaurant, that's a place for people to mix together, and there was a definite decision made that the quality of the food in the restaurant should be at a certain level to encourage people to stay in the building and have brilliant conversations. And the first thing I remember really feeling that there was a community was actually last year's Christmas party. That's just after everybody had finally moved into the building. We had a really big Christmas party, and Lily over there was nodding. And that really felt for the first time we were all the Crick. So there is a Cricksters social club. That was a bit of an afterthought. The staff pushed for that to happen, and management eventually realised, yes, that's a good idea to help to build community, to build interaction, collaboration. And the social club pushed very hard to get a bar on site, and we have got a bar which is open limited hours, 3 days a week. We don't yet have games facilities, but so indoor games facilities are coming. So these sorts of things have been bolted on a bit, but I think management has realised that social cohesion is important for good science. So I better stop there. Okay.
Okay, I had no idea what this was about, but I can continue on that theme of social cohesion from my experience at UCL, where size has reduced that sort of thing. It's made it much, much more difficult. In particular, the department which I joined in 1964, believe it or not, was had been always rated the best in the country for pharmacology. It was destroyed in 2007 by Malcolm Grant, and a huge department was then formed, known as neuroscience, physiology and pharmacology, where nobody knows each other. The tea room was shut down, and now if you go into the department, you see a sea of locked doors, because people don't, on the whole, come out for lunch. We have got a wonderful place for lunch, the house and room, where all the departments can mix, but most of them don't. It's just a very limited number of people go there. In particular, statistics, for example, always used to be there because they used to be right across the quad in the Pearson building, which is obviously where statistics belongs, but once they moved to Tottenham Court Road, they never appear in the Houseman anymore, so you can never find a statistician. If that had been the case in the late 60s, my career would have been very different, because it's by talking to statisticians I made a career, really. So I would rate the progress on that as being negative at UCL at the moment. If we're talking about wider communities, people outside the university, take the sort of people who listen to the Today programme, they're not going to get a very good idea of science, because if science appears, it's usually some psychology study, which is either a truism or untrue, probably untrue, judging by the reproducibility study. Occasionally quackery gets on, that's when I usually get called into it. But it's, they have, the false balance is unbelievable. I mean, they have the homeopath versus me, and the homeopath says I can cure everything, and I say, oh no, you can't, and people go away none the wiser. And of course the presenters don't know enough about science to ask the right question. Talk radio is a bit better because you can sometimes get hold of the conversation and address the other person yourself. On the Today programme it's very difficult because the producer always wants to do it. And universities don't help because they have become sort of PR machines themselves. They put out stuff which is terribly exaggerated. It's been well documented now. I really wonder if we'd be better without all of the meta-science people. I realize most of the people here are meta-science people. But there's an awful lot of them now. And quite often they're actually unhelpful. I mean, we had a Nature article in 2008, my last throw of my erstwhile job in single ion channel kinetics before I got into statistics. And we had a professional PR person from UCL who just was writing terribly hyped up rubbish, you know, and it was awful stuff. In the end, we didn't have a press release, but only because I insisted on it. And they'd only been asked for it because it was in Nature. We've got far better papers than that in other journals. And that's the sort of thing which really doesn't help science at all. And I ended up wondering whether the person we were employing was actually worth the money. I know that people say it's politically necessary, but I actually doubt that. I think politicians are not taken in by all the stuff about impact, which is largely made up, let's face it. If I get a grant to referee, it has a section about impact, which I simply don't bother to read because it's nonsense and made up stuff. I think politicians are not so stupid. They can't be persuaded by history. If you look at the history of really important things like lasers, which started off as a sort of toy and novelty in the lab, if you look at the early papers for that, they would seem very undistinguished. They probably didn't have many citations, I'll bet, for years. And the fact is that you can't, at an early stage, see what's going to be important. The only way to get the good things is to realize that 99% of the money you spend on research is going to be wasted. But there is no other way. No one's invented a more efficient way. And politicians have to understand that. I'm not sure that it really helps to pretend that the 99% of trivial stuff is really great. And if I see one more thing saying we've invented a screening test for so-and-so, I think I shall scream, because usually if you can get the numbers from them for the sensitivity and specificity of the test, it turns out that it's useless. It produces 90% false positives or something. Certainly true for dementia tests anyway. Subjects are much higher.
Not all communities work. That's all part of it as well, isn't it?
Sorry?
What I'm trying to say is that, and this is actually one of the points I wanted to... sorry, beg your pardon. One of the things I want to say, and actually it's something that has been touched on, is that not all communities work, and I think that's an important point, because one of the... I was speaking with someone earlier, I don't know if they're in the audience, I was trying to say, oh yeah, I want to do this session about communities. The lab is your first community, and she was telling me, my lab was not a community. We all competed against each other. It was horrible. And that's okay. Well, it's not okay. No, let me correct that. It is not okay. But, then maybe there's other communities that will help you if the lab, for example, is not a community. And you were mentioning that in your department. There was a community. In a sense, people did something that ended up ruining it, which is a bit of a pity. So hopefully, we will pass on to you. But then once you can join in with questions, feel free to join in and tell us about communities that don't work or bad community experiences, and maybe what we can learn from them about becoming better communities. Okay. Yes, you wanted to talk about the lab, actually. So
yeah,
this is a good,
actually, so I wasn't really about community until like 2 hours ago. I didn't really think about it before. And I realized, talking to Kat, that actually the lab community is very important. First, in the lab, obviously, you arrive, you don't know how to do some experiments. People are helping you, are training you. Good and bad days. It's quite nice to have people around. But then I realized that it goes far beyond just the lab life. When I built Pint of Science France, it was actually on lab community. All the Paris people that started Pint of Science, they were ex-lab mates. So basically, I
kind of forced them into Point of Science, or at least I told them, oh, can you help me to start it? And then Bordeaux started thanks to ex-lab mates of a friend that is in my lab. So basically I realized that the lab helped me build Point of Science France. So really this is a good community that when you're lucky, it's really helping you, and not just for the lab, actually, it's helping you beyond it, and I think it's quite good.
So just one more thing before, hopefully you can join in, because this is meant to be an unconference, right? So because we haven't really planned, I mean, we know as much as you, so please ask questions and make comments. But one of the things I was thinking that maybe hasn't been touched on, based one of my previous experiences, that community doesn't necessarily mean just the people you interact physically with. So one of the things I noticed when I worked for the Node, which was building an online community for developmental biologists, one thing I've noticed was very clear is that it didn't matter whether people were physically in the same space, right? So if you are in the same institute, the cafeteria is a great community space. But if you are in labs across the world, the thing that's the most important is that you feel like you're part of a community, right? Because my experience from my DPhil was that I was a cell biologist, and actually cell biologist doesn't feel like a coherent group, but the developmental biologists really feel like they belong to that community, and that's stronger than their physical barriers. So that's just something to bear in mind when you join in, is to think, what communities do you belong to, which are not the people necessarily next to you, and what are the difficulties that come when you're making these long-distance connections. So just something to bear in mind. So does anyone want to join in and ask a question?
If that's okay, in an unconference, I would like to just chip in and add some thoughts. And
Yeah,
thank you for
please
sharing,
do,
actually. It's really interesting to hear different stories and be reminded of the human side of science, all these stories that we don't always talk about. And just to remind ourselves of the importance of communities, as you just said, Kat, I think it's good to remind ourselves that things like Brexit happen because some communities, not in London, but near Liverpool maybe, felt left behind, and we failed to connect with them. So I really do think that communities is our chance to solve issues and solve conflicts and go forward and have a better outcome for everyone. So also my experience at the Royal Society, so where I work now after being an academic, is to work on data and digital technologies. And that's really interesting because that's an area where it makes us think, what does it mean to be human in the 21st century? Sorry, I'm going to go into the gloom and then show you that I beg to be optimistic. Yeah, there will be a happy ending. So, you see in the media talks about AI and Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking. They say AI will spell the end of humanity. You've got the metaphor of Terminator. By the way, in Terminator, there's also in Terminator 2, the Terminator becomes nice. So when you wonder how we will work with machines, think about that. Going beyond the bad relationship memory. And so, yes, okay, AI might be better than us at analyzing all the open data. So maybe they will replace us at doing some things. Okay, so that's worrying because we don't see what we're going to do next. But let's ask ourselves, what's our USP, as they say in sales, our unique selling proposals? That's also something you think about when you change career and you're like, I'm a scientist, what can I sell? We are humans, and machines are not humans, and they're really bad at being humans. They will still have a long way to go before being humans. And maybe we don't want them to be humans as well. So it's going very philosophical. But just to say, we have this chance of bringing this human side in all the things we do in life. So the other day we organized a conference. It was on privacy and technology. And there's a guy in medicine who told us, it's really interesting because clearly we've become really good at treating disease, but we are less good at treating patients. So that shows us how things become dehumanized as we scale up and try to be more and more efficient and do exactly the right outcome and stuff. And we forget to be humans and to nurture this aspect. So I want to say our chance is to be humans, and we know how to do that. So let's not forget that. And just to add a bit to the gloom and bounce again, we've talked a lot today about the system being broken, and I think that's true. Clearly, the science system is broken. But my line manager once told me, you know, in Chinese, the word crisis is spelled with 2 pictograms, danger and opportunity. So it's hard to see sometimes. I mean, I clearly see danger first when there's a crisis, but then I see the opportunity. And I think in academia, our great chance is that there's a lot of freedom. It's a big mess as well. But there's an opportunity there to construct something together, maybe through an unconference or something like that. So that's just my 2 cents.
So let's make sure robots don't form a community then. That's the message.
But I think your comment about your friend saying we can cure a lot of things, but we can't. What was it?
We can cure diseases, but not patients.
Yeah, but it's not true, unfortunately. We can't cure most diseases. There's only a handful of things we can cure. Really, only bacterial infections are the only things that can be cured. The rest of the things may be slowed down or palliated, but there's hardly anything we can cure, including very common things like low back pain. It's that sort of exaggeration which gets medicine and science in general a bad name, I think.
So actually, I misquoted him probably because he said we got better at treating disease, but we didn't get better at treating patients.
Yeah, well, we got better, yes, but not much better.
This is the ring. Mainly disease, not the patient as a whole. Just focus on one disease or 2 or whatever the patient has. So you have to use the word disease more than patient in that case, in the case of research.
So I thought we have a question here?
Yeah. I'm just wondering about whether the high turnover rate in academia poses a challenge for building communities and making academics feel a part of community. Because obviously, if you're around for 4 years, how deep roots are you going to put down in a certain institution?
So maybe I can just give a quick answer, and then if you guys want to join in. So one thing I've noticed in jobs like the ones I've been in, where so much of it relies on people feeling like they're part of the community. Sorry, can you hear me? Is that you have to take into account that the community isn't static. So, because I remember, when we were running this community site, we would go to the end of one year and go, oh, this is looking good. We have these many people participating, these many people contributing, and then you go, oh yeah, but by the end of this year, a group of PhD students will have finished, they will have moved fields, and so on and so forth. So that's definitely. So I don't think it's just something that you have to bear in mind. I think the other thing that I've noticed as well in academia is that when you're a graduate student, because often you're part of a graduate program, when you come into your institute, there's a group of people that even if your lab community is not very good, you're part of that student community. But there it's much clearer where your entry point and exit point to that community is, right? You join in when you join your PhD, you finish when you graduate. I think postdocs often feel more disenfranchised. Because again, PIs hopefully tend to be supported. So again, when they come in, they join the community of PIs. Postdocs can come in at any time of the year. They can stay for as long as they can. Some have fellowships, some are paid by their lab. So I always feel like the postdocs are often the forgotten side of the community. I'm not quite sure they're supported within the community quite as much. I don't know if you guys want to.
Well, I think that's true that there is a challenge from the constant turnover, but that's true of other institutions such as a school. I think you can still have a school ethos and some values which are carried forward longer than just the length of time that particular students stay at the school. And that's something CRIC is, the senior management I think are aware that they need to do a bit more work on articulating what are the CRIC values for working here, and they're wanting to try and think a bit more about that so that we do create the conditions. You can't create the community, but you can create the conditions for the community to be sustained.
Following up what you are just saying, that you are willing or ready to create the conditions for the community. Are you talking about the external community? And I want to follow external, outside the Creek Institute, because you, at the beginning, you spoke about various community within the science field or academic field of the people who works in the science field. Now, there is an existence a much greater and much important community to the creek, which is the external community surrounded this building. And you know, because I met you in previous research conference, and from the very beginning, and we members of this local community who live in the local area outside the creek building has been contributed not only to this project from the very beginning, but to all the projects, to the progress of all this neglected area. The St. Pancras Town has been left out for many years, now is growing. And thanks to that, to the support of the local community and the local authorities and all the local groups, all the borough of London, we do have the Creek Institute in this area for convenience, because we are close to all these stations, the St. Pancras International Station, and all this. But what is important is that the local community or the community, because there are various groups in the area, not only here, but in the borough and in London, they are all considerate for this, not only for the creek, but for all the rest of the scientific field, which is linked with the creek through the partnership. All the universities, as the gentleman says, they are not really happy because they are affected, and if they are not considered or excluded, they feel in worse condition. They need to be considered as people who has lived here in this country, I should say, in this country for many, many years, like myself, if I should say, yeah? And they need to be considered for trainings, lab trainings, or whatever is coming along. Thank God and thanks to you and all of you, because I continue to be linked with the creek. Yeah. Okay.
So, well,
thank you.
My comments were addressed just to the community inside the creek, but it's true that we are part of the broader community. Of course, we do have a community engagement manager, and she has a small team that do various works with the community. And as Lily mentioned earlier, the Living Centre has a lot of community activities in. We also have, in terms of employment for the local community, we just established an apprenticeship scheme. So we have 6 apprentices who are working in the creek and are studying at a local college to do a BTEC in biology. So that's a scheme that we hope to continue and expand, so that there will be a route for local people to come and work at the creek. And there's also a schools engagement team. Within Camden schools, there are state schools, there are 20,000 students, and the creek's aim is that every year they will engage with all of those 20,000 school students. So we have a discovery lab in the front of the building where various school groups come and do experiments and learn about science. Crick staff also going out into schools, and there are various other events. So we're trying very hard to engage with all of the borough of Camden as well through the schools activities. So I think that there is an awareness that we need to push out from just being in this building, but it's true, we tend to focus a little bit on ourselves within the building a lot of the time.
Just quick following up from Frank there, obviously being at the Crick. We also, there's a couple of things that are starting to happen a little bit now from the staff as well. It's not just coming from the top. So I know we've got quite a lot of staff that are involved with Good Gym, which is actually a scheme that's all over London, which is like a Good Gym, it's called. And it's a fitness scheme. So actually we would do running, for example, but we run between maybe community gardens and help do the community gardens, or run to get paired with an elderly resident that we then would then sit and have communications with, have a chat with, basically, which is a great one. In addition, I know that the BAME network have recently, they hosted during the Black History Month, they had a screening of Hidden Figures here, and they invited the local community, and there were somewhat around sort of maybe 20 to 30 teenagers from the local area that came in, and it was all public for anyone to come into as well. So I think where we are in the Crick, we need to do these things for sure, and I think we're working on it and we're continually improving. If you're in an institute where you don't think that these things are happening, it's worth having a look, because they probably are happening somewhere in their institute. It's just you've got to try and find them sometimes, which is a little bit difficult.
Yeah, and maybe this is hopefully one thing we can take out of this session today, is to think, when we're thinking which, just spend 5 minutes thinking which communities do we belong to. And I think it's very easy to stick to the communities that think like us. And sometimes we forget that, we are part physically, of a city, of a town, of a neighborhood, and maybe those are communities we should consider as well. I think there was a question here.
Hi, thanks very much. I think the community is a massive topic and really important, so I think it is great that we're talking about it today. So I just want to pick up on your point about postdocs. So I completely agree that they're not really, it's maybe more of a fractured community than some of the other stages in a researcher's career. So we have 100,000 PhD students in the UK at the moment, and a lot of them will want to become postdocs. I do workshops at universities all around the UK, and when I ask the PhD students, for example, what do you want an academic career, 60 to 70% of them will raise their hand and they want an academic career. And I think picking up on some of the points that Eva, I think, said earlier, that we don't really communicate this to them well enough, that there maybe aren't going to be enough spots, permanent positions. It just brings me back to the sort of community of postdocs. So how can we engage postdocs more in communities and, even little sub-communities within the postdocs? Because you'll have a postdoc who's 1 year out of their PhD and one that's 25 years out of their PhD. How do we bring them together? And then maybe picking up on the skills that we have as part of our title today, what kind of skills can we help postdocs try and get? Because if a lot of them are not going to have an academic career and they're going to go into something else, how can we help them to build skills to maybe go and work in other research related things like publishing, or completely out with the research domain altogether? I'd just be interested to hear what anyone has to say on that area.
So in UCL, what we did in ION Institute of Neurology, we realized that actually lots of things were happening for PhDs, but nothing for postdocs. So we created the postdoc meeting that was once a month. I don't remember the name, and no one's there. But basically the idea was to network, so to have one postdoc every month presenting their work, and it was just for them because we had nothing for just postdocs. So they were presenting works, and then we would have drinks, so we would network and talk, and so exchange as well, experiments and ideas, and even sometimes skills, I need to do that, but actually I have the machine to do it on the 5th floor, and you don't know because the building is so big. But we also did things, instead of having normal talks, we had talks from, let's say, editors and people that were outside of academia that came to say, this is what I've done, this is my career, and how, when you're a postdoc, you can reach to that career, because you realize that sometimes postdocs are not going to be postdocs forever. They might go and not be PI and leave research. So it's what we tried to do for postdocs, and actually was quite good. But it's true that normally nothing happens for postdocs, it's always PhDs.
I should say that one thing that's true for communities is is that, you know, you can go to an institute where there is that community set up, or you can do it yourself, which is what happened in my old institute when I was there a PhD student, but when I was there, the postdocs weren't organized at all. And in the last few years, they really got together. Like, for example, you know, the institute where I'm at, there is a mentoring scheme. The institute where they are, there was no mentoring scheme. So they set it up themselves. And then now pairing themselves with group leaders, they gain together, they share information. So communities can already be there, and you can join and help them grow, or you can create your own community if you think there's a need there. I don't know if anyone in the audience is a postdoc, has been a postdoc, has good ideas. It's okay if you're not a postdoc and no one did want to mention this.
I was a postdoc, but my question wasn't about postdocs. I guess I wanted to pose a question to you guys and maybe the rest of the audience, but I feel like right now we have lots of communities. You asked what communities do you belong to. I feel like I belong to several, but also I feel like we live in a current climate that is increasingly divisive. People identify based on various criteria. How do we connect communities to make them more welcoming, inclusive, and safe? Because if you look at Twitter as an ecosystem, it has been made very, very unsafe with the rising level of Nazis and white supremacists. It was pretty much what got Donald Trump elected. What is the responsibility of community managers to keep that from happening in other spaces that we may belong to?
Does anyone want to say anything?
Twitter, I think I'm up to 96,000 tweets at the moment. I'm about to hit the dreaded 100K. Well, a large fraction of them are retweets, of course. And they divided it, I'm not sure on the proportions, ranting about Brexit, about which I'm furious and intend to stop over my dead body. I think it won't happen, actually. And the other ones are sort of technical aspects of statistics, where I found it quite useful, actually. Even with 140 characters, one could carry on a conversation with somebody who was interested in statistical inference. And neither of those is nasty in the sense that you're talking about, and they're proper communities. I mean, if you get a white supremacist, then just block them and move on. I've actually found it very useful as a community. We've had at one point three-way conversations between statisticians here and in the west coast of America and in Australia. Got to pick your time of day for that one, but it's really useful sort of community. In the lab, I only ever had a small lab, and I used to put as much importance on people getting on with each other as I did on their academic ability, actually. What I used to try to do if they came from outside London was to have them at home in the interest of saving hotel money, but also in the interest of getting to know them in an informal way. Now, HR say that's illegal, of course, and you aren't allowed to know anything about a candidate before appointing them. This does not help, in my view. Just another bit of HR politics. That's a favourite hashtag of mine.
So, I mean, one thing, I think you're right. I think the community should, I think each community should take the responsibility of reaching out to their equivalents or the right ones. I mean, as I say, I've never, the one community where I remember that we were trying to make connections was when I was working on this developmental biology community effectively. We were trying to find what are the other communities that overlap with us, because science collaboration and so on, so then we try to reach out to the cell biologists, to the computational biologists, so on and so forth. And I think there's equivalents of this at all levels, right? Like that lady was saying in the audience, if you're a scientist, maybe you think, what the other scientist communities I should interact, how about my local community? And I think that's true at all levels, so I think you make a very good point.
So are you talking about online communities?
Just everything, because there is I think there's a common problem of certain bad actors making communities unsafe, and when that happens, how should the community respond?
I think in online communities it's a particular challenge. There may be less feeling of cohesion between the different players. That I think it's harder to be really rude to somebody in person than it is to be online. So that's where the personal side helps. But in terms of different scientific communities, that's something within the CRIC. We have a number of different biomedical and other disciplines there are interest groups, but there are no departments or divisions, so that there are 100 research groups and people are expected to collaborate with each other without any divisions coming in the way. And the whole purpose of the building is designed to facilitate people bumping into each other, collaborating, and really mixing up those different disciplines so that people do generate new and interesting connections.
So I think we only have 2 or 3 minutes left. Are there any other burning questions or comments?
I just quite add a quick comment on online communities. Part of it, I think, in terms of like navigating sort of online hazards, it's also knowing who to go to that could offer support. So for instance, I work for Understanding Animal Research, and we do actually offer support to people that get pushback online about their research. So it's think about what kind of other communities you could access that might have navigated this before you, that can offer you the skills and how to talk about things, possibly get you other people that could talk about it as backup, basically. It might not help for sort of minor trolls, but in terms of actually sort of professional dangers that could be out there, that can be really helpful.
Okay, so let's wrap up. Thank you very much for joining our improvised unconference.